Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Attaining the Second Cognition. I'm Endall Beall, and I would like to thank all of our subscribers and viewers for taking the time to listen to our work in an effort to advance themselves. If you are a new subscriber or have recently discovered our body of work, I welcome you. For those who have been following our work since the presentation of the Practical Spirituality video, you have been on what may seem like a disruptive roller coaster ride where you feel that everything you once felt true has been challenged, and hopefully your perceptions have altered for the better as a result of the information and challenges we provided. Some of our subscribers may wonder why we cover so many subjects in our presentations, and some have probably wondered what is the ultimate point we are seeking to achieve by being so broad spectrum in our approach to providing this information. These questions will be answered in this presentation, which is entitled Spherical Thinking. When I write my scripts, I have a tendency to use generalizations when providing my explanations. Many people don't like generalizations because they feel that they are the exception to the rule of such generalized observations. In fact, most people feel that they are the exception to the rule, so much that it keeps entire cultures living in a state of cognitive denial. When we hear these things presented in a generalized form, our sense of individuality is loaded and ready to see these generalizations in other people, but we rarely see that we are very often guilty of the same habits and behaviors that they can find fault with in others. It is the rare individual indeed who can look in the mirror and see themselves in the same light they cast the others in. What this creates is a very linear and rigid perspective. In order to advance into the second cognition, we have to break this indoctrinated habit of linear thinking. There are those who will protest that they are not indoctrinated. Indoctrination is defined as adhering to a form of doctrine. A doctrine is not only defined as a political ideology or religious or spiritual belief. Each culture has its own doctrine of national and cultural identity. No matter where you were born on the planet or which culture you were born into, there was already a pre-established cultural doctrine that shapes how you think and how you perceive the world around you. This is the type of indoctrination I would like you to see as this presentation continues. Within these cultural doctrines, we find the subcultural doctrines of politics and religion, which can be further broken down into other subcultural divisions of race, gender, sexual orientation, and even down to the level of team sports and competition of varied fans for their favorite sports teams. The human race is indoctrinated on many levels, and what most people don't see is that they are often indoctrinating themselves into these doctrines by the choices they make to embrace whatever doctrine or belief they find appealing. Once we find a belief system that we agree with, we then saturate ourselves in the dogma of the particular doctrine. Using sports as the least volatile example, we get involved in learning our team's players. We immerse ourselves in learning team statistics. In baseball, we learn each team member's RBI rating and other generally meaningless facts, but to the sports fans, these are all critical details they feel they must know in order to speak knowledgeably on the topic of their accepted doctrine. Using just this one simple example, then it should be easy to see how we each indoctrinate ourselves with pre-existing doctrines and expected herd behavior once we decide which collective herd we choose to be a part of and how we work to learn that herd's indoctrination. Through our educational system, we are taught to think linear. This is an easy feat to perform since time seems to present a linear unfolding events. This linear unfolding is most profound in our lessons of history, where one event precedes another in a linear unfolding of time. We are taught to look at history in a sort of freeze-frame linear perception. For instance, that was then, but this is now. We are taught to separate events and keep them unrelated, carrying impressions through historical snapshots fed to us by those who write and control what history is allowed to be known through control and ownership of the publishing houses that print our history books, as well as mandating which historical myths will be taught to students to enforce any nation's cultural mythology. Through such controlled perceptions of history, we are programmed to think about everything in a linear and often fragmented form. Historical events appear unrelated when only part of the historical tapestry is revealed through controlling which part of the tapestry the student can view when given the accepted historical myths that are spun in our classrooms. The Fabian controllers don't want you to know much about history. They have done their utmost to make history colorless, leaching all the color out of the stories that shaped historical events. They tell selective parts of the story, and what they select when they print their history books is the picture they want you to see and nothing more. These selected excerpts of history are what shapes the cultural mythology of any nation. Each country has its national heroes, no different than the heroes from the mythology of ancient traditions around the world. Where Jesus, Krishna, Buddha, Theseus, Gilgamesh, or others were the heroes of ancient times, in the U.S. today, our cultural heroes are George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Paul Revere, and others. Every nation has its national heroes that each culture reveres in an almost godlike sanctity. The question I would like to ask our viewers is how many of you have blindly accepted what you were taught in these matters and never scratched the surface of the presumed linear history, or perhaps see a different picture than the one you were indoctrinated into believing? Are the events that you think of as history genuinely as unrelated as you perceive them to be? Is there perhaps a bigger picture that you have yet to perceive if you scratch the veneer of cultural mythology? And if there is a larger story behind this cultural veneer, how do you discover it? The truth is that based on linear indoctrination, we all have a tendency to see what's in front of our faces. We see a situation, and then we apply our own set of cognitive filters to make an assumption on what we see. The field of psychology has noted this through 100 years of psychological study, so this is not my random opinion. We all live our lives based on such assumptions, and rarely does the individual move beyond the initial assumption to discover that what they perceived and assumed as a result of that might be totally wrong. Another way to see this is called leaping to conclusions. When someone leaps to a conclusion, they are leaping to an assumption, and assumptions are based on our internal programming and individual cognitive filtering systems. Everyone views the world in accordance to their varied levels of cognitive programming. Whether we embrace a belief, whether it is instituted and indoctrinated through the educational system, or whether we indoctrinated into it like religion by our parents from childhood, these beliefs set up our individual systems of filtering information and forming assumptions based on these filters. Once these cognitive filters are in place, for most people, they rarely change. The world is always seen through a black and white filter where everything is weighed and judged by what our filtered programming dictates. What we have sought to do in our work, both in videos and through our books, is challenge these filtering systems that everyone has embraced in one form or another. Everyone has a different set of multi-layered filtering systems, and as such, not everyone is going to respond to the information we present in the same manner. Through the system of confirmation bias, humans generally gravitate to the things that reinforce their individual beliefs and choose to discount what disagrees with their own indoctrination. When the individual is confronted with something that challenges these beliefs, then the result is cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance arises when one's worldview is challenged. We all perceive things to be a certain way, and when we are confronted with any idea that challenges this perception, our instinct is to avoid the truth because it makes us feel very uncomfortable. If the truth we are presented with is powerful enough, we can often feel physically ill because it leads us to realize that we were wrong in what we believed. The physiological and psychological symptoms of these shattering truths is fear. Our mind reacts in fear, and our body can also react in fear when we are faced with that earth-shattering "oh shit" moment when we realize that we have been deceived. The harshest realization is not only that we have been deceived, but we have been deceiving ourselves by our continued beliefs for so long. Because the Hapim-infected ego will always avoid what makes it uncomfortable, it will go to any lengths to try and rationalize away the truth and use any type of illogical and irrational arguments to try and make the truth untrue so it can protect its cognitive turf and continue the belief that is previously chosen. This is where we find ourselves as a species, where everyone has some form of chosen belief system that refuses to entertain any other alternative to things than what they choose to embrace. To advance into the second cognition, the individual must go through a process of cognitive deconstruction. We are required to tear down our houses of incorrect perceptions and free our minds from the cognitive tyranny that we ourselves have played a major role in by imprisoning ourselves through self-indoctrination and beliefs. We have to take a larger view of things and escape from simplistic linear thinking and superficial impressions that lead to erroneous conclusions based on our own indoctrination. In other words, we have to learn to think bigger. We have to learn how to perceive things beyond what lies in front of our eyes. To do this, one must advance from linear thinking into what I call spherical thinking. What I have sought to do with my books and through our videos is show that things we previously thought were unrelated and separate are actually interwoven very tightly to create the perceptual world that surrounds us, but we don't usually see because we have indoctrinated ourselves into a very small cognitive box. On a cognitive basis, we have all been taught to paint ourselves into a corner. The purpose of our work is to get out of that small perceptual box, that limited perception of the world, and develop a new way to perceive things beyond these limitations. The road to the second cognition is about removing barriers and roadblocks to our consciousness. We first must acknowledge how we have painted ourselves into that cognitive corner and then decide to move past that and see things with a broader view and greater perceptual perspective. We have to learn to think spherically and break the limited linear habits that constrain our minds. Another way to express spherical thinking is by taking a 360-degree view of things. Contrary to how you may presently think, everything is not always as cut and dried as you may presently perceive. We do not live in a black and white dualistic world where there is always a right or wrong side. The world around us is grayer than it is black and white. There are wheels within wheels involved in every situation that you encounter. We must learn to see beyond the limited spectrum of what stands before us and reaching assumptive conclusions based on a two-dimensional picture of any given situation. We have to learn to step into the unknown gray areas and stop relying on black and white dualistic impressions of life. The only way to do this is to move from linear thinking into spherical thinking, where one can move beyond superficial impressions and assumptions to see the forces moving behind the scenes to create any situation in our lives. In other words, we have to learn to pay more attention to what may lie in our peripheral vision rather than just what lies before our eyes. To develop spherical perception requires that we learn to perceive nuance and discover what else might be the underlying causes of events rather than reaching snap judgments based on partial information and black and white interpretive factors. To grow one's soika means we have to see our own cognitive filtering systems at work. An example of how filtering works can be illustrated in our work. Where you may have accepted some of the observations offered about religion because it reinforces your own viewpoint, yet you balked when the same investigative reporting is done in reference to your alternative spiritual beliefs, your bias filters have kicked in. You can embrace and endorse part of the information but reject another part because that is your protected belief turf. We have had people, when the comments sections were left active, who would cheer us on so long as we were feeding their confirmation bias and supporting their beliefs, but who would later turn on us when we challenged their own beliefs. There are those who listened to what we were saying until I brought up space aliens through the Anunnaki presentation, at which point their minds shut off and they stopped listening. Once again, filtering leading to denial because it is not an accepted personal belief rears its ugly head. Everyone has their own filters firmly in place, and so long as those filters remain rigid and unbending, one's consciousness will not advance beyond those rigid filters of acceptance or denial. By saying this, I'm not saying that you are expected to agree with everything we present. I am saying, however, that you should give pause and ponder things more deeply than your black and white conclusions based on your indoctrination and filters. If you choose to disagree with what I present, then do some research to find some information that can refute it or grow the wisdom to consider things in a spherical perspective. Advancing consciousness is about growth and expansion, not taking new concepts and trying to squeeze them into the tiny boxes of first cognition perception. If you want to expand your awareness, you have to expand your perceptions. You can't say that you want to grow and choose to remain the same and achieve that goal. This would be similar to a ship tied to a dock that wants to go to sea but refuses to cast the landline for you to do so. You can't stay tied to one system of cognition and sail into another if you demand to stay tied to the dock. I'd like to thank all our listeners and subscribers and those who are seeking a new horizon and better way for our species to live. This is a hard road and worth the journey. For those doing the work, until next time, stay the course and don't give up on yourself.